Okay, hi everyone. So I'm just going to quickly talk about a project I've been working on this year, which has been gathering historic earthworm records and records for species that we don't have many records of or didn't have many records of before. So just a little bit of background to the project and the recording scheme. A lot of you on the call tonight probably already know this history. But in 2009, a group of earthworm scientists, mainly based at the Natural History Museum in London, but also some other institutions, worked together to gather basically as many records as they could find of earthworms in Britain. And this was the first time that anyone had really kind of looked through different sources and contacted different researchers to try and gather one database of earthworm records. They managed to get 3,941 records, and this is of all earthworm species across the UK, and this really highlighted a lack of recording and a lack of knowledge and a lack of data for earthworms. So from this, this kind of really influenced and helped to form the Earthworm Society of Britain. And then in 2014, we officially launched the Earthworm Recording Scheme. And there's been a big focus through that on going out into the field, recording earthworms that we find, and training people in how to do that. So we spent a lot of time teaching people different sampling and field techniques to collect earthworms, and then also identification skills. And I know a lot of you here tonight will have been on some of those courses, so thank you and welcome back. We've also done some work through the recording scheme, contacting various researchers and scientists that we know and getting their databases and their records as well from them. So I started this project in December last year, and at that point we had 21,987 records for all earthworm species in the recording scheme. And these were from across Britain, Ireland, and the Channel Islands. And almost all of them were from Britain. A couple of years ago, Kieran and Aidan managed to get quite a big data set from Ireland. And this included some historical records, some of which were about 100 years old. So this was all from the National Biodiversity Data Centre in Ireland. But apart from that Irish data set, the oldest record that we had for an earthworm in Britain was from 1965, which obviously isn't actually that old. Also, 93% of all of the records that we had from Britain had been collected in the last 20 or so years. So we really didn't know very much about earthworms before the year 2000. So before I go any further, I just want to make sure that we all do know what a biological record is and that you understand what I'm talking about. So biological recording is the scientific study of the distribution of living organisms, and biological records can be used to describe the presence, abundance, associations, and changes both in time and space of wildlife. So it's made up of 4 pieces of information, and it's basically a who, what, where, when of wildlife or an organism. So the who is the name of the recorder. So in this case, we're looking for the name of the person who found an earthworm. The what is the species of earthworm that they found. The where is the location. So for the earthworm recording scheme, ideally, we like this to be a grid reference. And then we also want to know the when. So ideally for the recording scheme, this would be the date that the earthworm is found. Sometimes that information isn't available and we might end up with a month or a year instead. In order to say anything about the distribution and abundance of a species, we need biological records. And you can't know how the distribution and abundance of a species is changing or potentially how climate change might have an impact if you don't have biological records and you don't have data. So biological recording is really, really important. So back to my project. So before I started, we had 1,389 records of earthworms that had been collected before the year 2000, and nothing in Britain from before 1965. But we obviously know that there were earthworms in Britain before 1965. And we also know that there were lots of scientists and naturalists who were studying earthworms before 1965 and certainly prior to the year 2000. So this led to Natural England approaching us and basically giving us some funding to try and find some of these records and convert them into a National Earthworm Recording Scheme format, verify them where we could, and basically enhance the recording scheme with records, with historical records and records of particularly rare species or unrecorded species. So we identified three kind of potential sources of where we might be able to find these records. And that was historical journals and publications, museum collections, and then other institutions, universities, individual researchers who we know have spent a lot of time working on earthworms. So this all led to me spending a couple of really, really good days last December in the Natural History Museum in London. Thank you very much to Emma for helping me out with this, answering all my questions and giving me access to the collections. Because I was very limited for time, I basically very quickly, systematically went through all of the British earthworms and just took photographs of the labels. And then in the new year, got home, got all these literally thousands of photos onto my computer and then went through transcribing all the labels. I then used a couple of, sort of different online tools and just various kind of research, Googling, to try and enhance the data or improve the data that we had on the labels. So the one in the picture, for example, the location is just Bangor, North Wales, which is a location, but it's not that specific and potentially doesn't tell us that much. But I was still able to convert this into a grid reference, find out what vice county Bangor is in, and using the NHM's data portal also managed to find out the people that actually recorded this specimen. So we then got our who, what, where, when for that specimen. One of the highlights of the collection at the Natural History Museum was this species, is Sparganophilus tomesis. This is a species that is very rare in the UK. And we actually didn't have any records for it in the recording scheme. However, all of the earthworm species lists for the UK do recognise it as being a species present in the UK, even though we didn't have any records. So in the Natural History Museum, I came across the type specimen. So the picture on the left, the jar with the red lid, highlights that this is the type specimen. So that's the original specimen for this species that was used in the scientific publication when this species was first described to science. And from the label in the jar, managed to find some information to turn this into a record. And I also managed to find the original description of this species. And from there, there's actually loads of information, in this case, about the specific location and also the specific habitat that this specimen was found in. So we've actually got now a really detailed record, although it's only one for this particular specimen, but a really detailed record with lots of location and habitat data. And then the museum does have a few specimens of this species. So we've gone from having no records at all of Sparganophilus tomesis to having a few now. I also contacted various other museums and researchers, and National Museums Wales, National Museum Scotland, and the Oxford University Museum of Natural History were all really helpful and sent me all of the information they had for their earthworm collections. And Emma Sheard, who did her PhD on earthworms up in Scotland, in I think about 2014, a lot of her fieldwork was done. She also very kindly sent me all of her data from her PhD. So whilst that's much more recent data, it's also lots of data for Scotland where we didn't have that many records before. So the funding for this project ended in January, so it was only really a month I was working on it. But since then, throughout the year, I've got a little bit kind of addicted to reading old journal articles about earthworms and kind of getting the records out of them. And so just in my spare time, whenever I can, I've been sitting at the computer reading old articles. Someone who I feel like I've got to know reasonably well is Hildrich Friend. So he was a minister, and he travelled all around the UK and Ireland in the late 1800s. And he was a really keen sort of amateur naturalist, recorded all sorts of different groups very interested in biological recording. He had a particular focus on botany and worms. And he published literally thousands of articles in various journals and magazines. And so I've been reading through some of those and kind of mining the records from them. And then he also had a network of friends and naturalists all around the country who were sending him earthworm specimens as well. So just from him alone, we've got lots and lots of records of a wide range of species, and also from a really wide geographical range as well. So all over Scotland, Wales, England, and Ireland. So from the whole project, I've managed to gather 5,152 new records. Approximately half of those I think I've submitted to the recording scheme already, so they were included in Kieran's talk earlier, but approximately the other half I haven't yet, but I will do in the next few weeks, certainly before the end of this year. So I think that does guarantee 2023 to be our best ever year in terms of new records for the recording scheme. The oldest record, as I said, in Britain prior to the project was from 1965. We now have a record from 1861, so over 100 years previously, and we have over 2,500 records now from Britain before 1965. So we've got a reasonable amount of information now about earthworms before or in the early 1900s. And previously we only had 1,389 records from before about 20 years ago, whereas we now have over 8,300. So that's Britain and Ireland. But yeah, hopefully we've learned or can learn a lot about earthworms historically. So these graphs show the percentage of earthworm records in the recording scheme broken up by decade. So at the top, this is before the project, just from the recording scheme, and you can see that over 80% of all the records we had have been collected since the year 2000, and there's very little collected before that. At the bottom is the new data from the project combined with the original recording scheme data. And the main thing to note is that there's a lot more coloured blocks. So this means that we now have records and information about earthworms in lots more decades than we used to have. And you can actually see that just over 30%, so up to the green block, just over 30% of all of the records in the recording scheme now, once I've submitted my ones, are from before the year 2000, so are more than 20 years old. This graph shows the percentage of records by species that we had in the recording scheme before the project in blue, and then in orange are the percentage of the records for that species that have been added to the recording scheme from the project. And you can see that for some species, we've made a huge difference in terms of our knowledge. So Sparganophilus tomesis, the one I mentioned at the museum before, we didn't have any records before, so we now 100% of the records that we have in the recording scheme are from this project. We're still talking about very low numbers of records for these species, but we do now have some records for them. Also interestingly, or I thought interestingly, so we've now got 6 records for this Sparganophilus tomesis species, but they're not just 6 records from the same location. It's 6 records from 4 different vice counties that have quite a big geographical spread. And so that potentially tells us that it's potentially quite a widespread species. It's certainly not just confined to one area from looking at this data. So it might be worth going out and having a look more for this species. Helodrillus oculatus is another species that's very rare. So the graph on the left shows the vice counties that it had been recorded in before the project. We only had 8 records of it. We now have a total of 45 records of Helidrillus oculatus, and again, you can see there's a lot more vice counties that it's now found in, including up in Scotland and in Wales. And so that just leads me to say a huge thank you to Matthew Shepherd at Natural England for funding the project and approaching us to do this project. Big thank you to Emma as well at the Natural History Museum for giving me access to the collections, answering all the questions, helping out. Also, big thank you to Teresa Derbyshire at National Museum in Wales, Fiona Ware in Scotland, and Robert Douglas in Oxford, who were all really generous with their time. The Earthworm collections at all of these museums are not digitised. They're not kind of available electronically. It wasn't just a simple sent to be a spreadsheet of data. They had to go into the collections, photograph the jars on the labels on the jars, like I was, or transcribe information. Some of them actually registered and inputted all the information. So they were all really generous with their time. Also, thank you to Emma Sheard again for sending her PhD data. And finally, a huge thank you to all of the Earthworm Society members and anyone that's ever submitted a record. Without the success of the previous 10 years of the recording scheme and the success of the Society and the support that we've had from you, the project would have never happened in the first place. Natural England would have never approached us to do it. So huge thank you to all of our recorders and everyone who's ever supported the Society. And that just leads me to attempt to answer any of your questions.